Hey, so today we're going to be talking about keeping things planar. What is planar geometry? Why does it matter? And when does it matter? So first, just kind of get right into it. Let's take a look at these two squares that we have here. Now, right now, they're exactly the same, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one of them non-planar, which basically means it's no longer perfectly flat. So if we pull this up, we can see that this piece of geometry now has these two verts, has this vert, and this one. Now the problem is, you can see that the face actually kind of gets pushed inwards because all geometry gets broken into a triangle at the end of the day. And like, you don't want to have these types of pieces of geo because then it becomes extremely hard to work with later, cut any detail into, and just generally doesn't look good when you're making very hard-edged objects. Now, does it mean that this is always bad? No. And we'll get into when and why you should and shouldn't have these things later. But so, if you see, when I turn on hard edges, and I make the smoothing groups hard, you can see now that this is actually an error. And so, if you look at this one, you can see that it's still perfectly flat. Now, what practical use does this have is something you're probably asking yourself. Well, why does it matter? Why does it matter if it's not planar? Well, there's some instances where it doesn't matter, but one of them can be sub D, especially if you don't mean to have the surface be non-planar. Let's say you're making a gun, and parts of the gun are no longer perfectly flat. Well, if you start cutting details into it, it's not going to work very well. So let's quickly just kind of show examples where this type of thing happens, and you'll understand why it's very important. So I'm just going to make this thing a little bit non-planar, just a little bit to show how it can still be very bad. And I'm going to start cutting details into it, and you're going to see why this is a bad thing and why you want to keep things perfectly flat. I'll also show you examples of where I do this. So let's just say I want to start cutting in some sci-fi I'll exaggerate a little bit just for effect. So like I said, this isn't going to shade well. So let's start cutting in some details. So let's say I just want to put like, some kind of like surface detail right here. And we're just going to do it nice, quick, and dirty, for example. It doesn't really matter. You can see already we're getting all these really bad shading errors, and things are not looking good. And so we're going to subdivide this at the end. We'll inset this really quick, do another one down. Let's push it over to make it look a little more interesting. Cool. So we didn't subdivide it yet, but you can already tell that this is not good. This is going to look very bad. No matter how well I put my edge loops, no matter how good my edge flow is, this is not going to end well. So let's keep going. We'll put our edge loops in. So let's just use the cut tool really quick, and I'm going to cut in some edge loops. Cool. Well, let's say we need to put them on here, because we do. Let's put a quick swift loop in. So I'm already going to tell you right now, this is going to look horrible. And it's going to pinch, and it already looks bad. So it's good, because this is what we expect. You don't want to have non-planar geo, especially if you plan to cut stuff into it. Again, non-planar just means it's not perfectly flat. So let's subdivide this. You can see we're already starting to get shading errors right here. You can see it's pinching a little bit right over here. And then on top of it, you'll notice that there's a gradient from one side to the other. Very, very not good. Imagine if this was a gun or a different object. You would not want to have this be the case. And let's say I need to put cut lines into this now. So I'm like, oh, okay, we'll put a cut line here. And then, let's cut this piece out. I'm not caring about accuracy because it's just an example, but, sorry. There you go. Nice 3ds Max bug where, ending the cut tool adds extra edges. It's fun. It's a good one. I like that bug. Alright, cool. Let's put some quick edge loops in here. And so what happens as soon as I start cutting these things and moving stuff around, I'm already making the surface even worse, because then it's taking that where that vertex was, and now it's moving it, and it's just making the face even more broken. So let's just add some edge loops before we cut out the shape, because then it's less work at the end of the day, instead of cutting them on the outside, which I'll probably make a video on, like tips for speeding up the edge loop process. Anyway, so we'll delete this. Let's extrude this edge down and they'll kind of collide. Cool, no big deal. So you can see already, as soon as I want to add these cut loops, or these cut lines, and I start adding these support loops to make it hard edged on these parts, it's just going to get worse and worse. And I'm just going to terminate the edge loops at the edges of the faces for now, because that's also what I would do if this was flat. So let's take a quick look with this subdivided and see what a train wreck it's going to look like. You can already see it's a pretty big one. You know, you can make smooth edges and like change your smoothing groups, but you can still see all of these ugly pinches. These are not things that you want on your model at all. And so you can see it's just not going to smooth well. It just simply won't. We start to get hard pinching here, 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 here. So this is really bad. This is something you must avoid. Now, let me quickly go over a few ways before I get into showing this on a flat plane and why it matters, and some examples. I'm going to quickly just show some ways to fix this and troubleshoot it. So first things first, we'll just start with a plane and I'll show some ways. So let's make this non-planar. Let's put an edge. Now, you'll notice that right now it's okay. You know, it's not bothering you until you look at it at an angle and you realize it's actually really messed up and it's not going to shade well. When you look at it like this, you're like, yeah, that's fine. So here's what you do. You make the edges hard. Now, I have this hotkeyed, but in this video I'm just going to click this up here under the ribbon, the graphite modeling tools, hard edges. Let's just hit hard, and now you see, okay, well, when I have this turned into triangles, the shading is different on each face. This is not desirable, and this is what we were trying to avoid. But now we know, because we harden the edges and we can see where things are actually changing. So I'm going to go over 3 different ways that we can fix this issue. So the first one is the most janky and inaccurate, but sometimes, every great once in a while, you have to do this one. And it's simply moving the edge or the vertex down until you can no longer see the highlight and shifting your angle. It's very good to have a high spec material to help you to see these shading changes. But you can see at this point it's become imperceptible to me. Now, it's probably not perfectly flat at this point, but it's close enough. I generally don't do this unless I absolutely have to. Usually I use snaps or Subobject Pivot or Z-scaling or align tools. So I'm going to go over each one of those very quickly. So let's go over the first one, which is snaps. So snaps are up here, and you hit snaps toggle. Right click this. If we go into the snap settings, which I'll make a video on snaps at a later point, let's go on here and we'll turn on vertex snaps. This way we can snap vertices to other vertices. And if we go to options, we want to turn on enable axis constraints. And basically what this means is when I'm snapping, I can snap on one axis at a time, where if I turn it off, I can't do that anymore. It's just all of them at once. So those 2 things need to be on for this to work. So all we simply do, turn on snaps, click this on the Z axis, and snap it to this vert. You can see that it's now perfectly flat again. So that's one way to do it. Snaps is a great way to do it. Another one, we can do the align tools. So 3ds Max and other softwares have usually make planar or align on X, Y, or Z axes tools. I have these hotkeyed so that I can just do them on demand, but obviously this comes with a problem. Let's say you have a more complex object, right? And you can't afford to move both polygons up. As you can see, it picks the average of the distance, or the middle of them. And so everything moves, which is fine in this example, but when you have a more complex object like, say, this one, in the blockout stage, and let's say you need to keep this whole face perfectly flat, that's obviously not something that is feasible. But in this instance, and in some instances, the Align tool is great. And as a side note, I use the Align tool all the time. I highly recommend doing it because the other option is Z-scaling, which is basically the same thing. And everyone knows this trick, or a lot of people. It's just scaling and scaling and scaling until it's flat. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Every great once in a while, this is useful. I don't recommend it though, because it's slow, and you have to click a button, or you have to do more stuff, or hotkeying your Align tools is pretty straightforward and pretty fast. And so let's get to the third one. And this one actually requires a script called Subobject Pivot. And I'm going to be making a video on this later. And it's by Funky Bunnies. And he's just a 3D artist. And he has free scripts on his website. And I'll probably put a link to this in the description. But it's here called FB Subobject Pivot. So let's talk for a little bit. What is a subobject pivot and how do we use it? Just quick overview. Essentially what a subobject pivot means is that it aligns the pivot to any type of sub-object, so vertex, face, edge, etc. So when I turn this on, you can see that it's now aligned to this face. And so any object I move will be along this face. You can also scale with this, and that's actually what we're going to be doing. So I'll make a video on that later, how to get it set up, ways to use it. But so basically what we want to do is exactly what I just showed you. It's like Z-scaling, but we're using the pivot of a face. So I put the subobject pivot on this face that I have selected here, and so you can see that when I click this face, the pivot actually stays down here. So what happens is I can Z-scale it without moving the object at all. And this is incredibly important when you have a more complex model. And so that's why in a situation like this, it becomes necessary, because I can just click this face here and then scale the rest of these to match, or vice versa, right? So this is a blockout model from one of my guns I made. And it's very important for me to keep things planar, because as I add these edge loops, right, and these details, as soon as I start adding these types of things in here, I add these circles, and then I add like these little guys, this cut here. If this wasn't perfectly planar, especially with geo this dense on here, and using n-gons, which I'll make videos on n-gons too. N-gons aren't bad. If you disagree, I'll fight you about it. But anyway, yeah. I almost always keep every surface as planar as possible. And it takes a lot of practice, it takes time, and you kind of have to know what you can and cannot get away with. Does this mean that everything has to be planar? No. In organic polymodeling, no, that is not the case. So when you have more organic shapes like this, you know, I'm sure some of these you can see here, some of these faces become non-planar as they fade into this object. You know, over here we have plenty of non-planars and stuff that isn't as clean. But it doesn't matter. As long as it smooths well and you have good edge flow, it's okay. So this is an example where you can get away with it. So make sure you know the difference. When you have very hard surface stuff that needs to be flat, this is incredibly crucial, or else your shading is going to look bad. You limit the amount of details that you can cut into it, and you might even have to redo your geometry. So just know which types of things you need to keep planar, and try and keep them planar from a very early stage. So here's a blockout for a gun, the front of a gun that I made. Let me just show that really quick. I'll just show my portfolio a little bit too, since this is my first video and a lot of you may not know me or anything I've made. So if you go to ArtStation, I'll put this link in here. You can see a lot of these guns I've worked on. and you can see how, you know, they turned out and why it's important to keep them non-planar. You know, you don't see shading errors on any of these flat edges at the end of the day. Yeah. And so here's some viewport pictures of the final subdivided model. So anyway, the point is, know when and when you can and cannot get away with things. Know when it's important and when it's not. Like for example, all of these plane changes here, super important that these were planar. None of these are non-planar. And the beauty of non-planar stuff is that it's super easy to add edge loops to. So I'm just gonna quickly make the same thing over here with a perfectly flat piece, and as you suspect, it's going to turn out perfect because there's nothing that's going to be wrong with it. So let's just quickly make a similar shape. Let's make that width a little bit more even. Cut this shape out, whatever. Now I understand that this isn't perfectly accurate, but like I said, it's just a demonstration, so I'm not too concerned about it. And I'm actually going to probably make a video later as well about quick tips for quickly adding details to your meshes and kit bashing them in without having to make it a lot of work, because it's really not that hard once you get the hang of it. So let's just add the edge loops super fast. And you can see too, like, I can get away with more n-gons. I can get away with anything. As long as you have a flat surface, the topology is nearly irrelevant. You know, I use flat surfaces and perfectly flat surfaces to terminate edge loops like you're seeing here. And I'll make videos on that kind of stuff and, you know, more sub-D stuff as time goes on. Add these edge loops, and as you can see, it's already going way better than this one was. Which already looks just terrible. I know that these also aren't perfectly width apart, you know. This isn't a modeling tutorial as far as like adding edge loops. This is just to demonstrate non-planar versus planar. So you can see though, there's a huge difference, because one of these looks horrible and like garbage and the other one looks fine. So this is really the biggest and most important thing to look for. A lot of people make these mistakes a lot when they first get into modeling. And honestly, one thing I've kind of realized over the past year or so is that a lot of people don't actually know the difference between planar and non-planar geometry, which I never really realized that people didn't know that. So yeah, I'm just gonna quickly make a box or just like some kind of random shape. I don't really know what it is, just to kind of add to the tutorial or the video and just show you like keeping stuff planar a little bit. So there's a lot of operations you can do that will keep stuff from breaking being planar, and there's a lot of ways that you can push and pull geometry to retain its planarness. So for example, and this takes time and practice, and I don't expect you to understand it out of this video, but start thinking about this. How can I move these shapes around without making it broken on a different plane? So like, how can I change these shapes without it breaking the planarness on this one, or this one, or this one? See, like I just moved that, and this is already broken. You see that hard thing there. So I undid that. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do to kind of break up shapes without making them non-planar. Let's see. Using snaps, edge constraints, that there. I'm not going to go too crazy for this model. I'm going to keep it pretty simple for now. Not really focusing on design or anything, but just wanted to show, like, it's really important that you learn how to model with snaps. It's important that you learn to know when things will and won't be planar. And then just knowing how to push and pull forms without breaking things being planar. So I'm just going to kind of break these two shapes apart here. I'm going to delete the bottom. And so one quick thing you'll notice is that obviously I'm being super messy about these. And so what I do is when I talked about the align tools, I go through and I just align them. And chances are, like, when you're in this stage of the blockout, a lot of your cut lines and stuff are going to either have more details or they're going to be adjusted later on. So it's not a big deal. So now you can see we have two separate shapes. So I'm just going to keep making this a little bit more complex. So just let me quickly think about it. Yeah, whatever. I'll just do some random shape. So for this one, I'm going to actually make the extrusion that I want. I'm going to pull it up and you'll see how this keeps things planar. So if I pull this piece up, I can now start adding form without making any of these non-planar. So if I turn on hard edges again, you can see that it's actually looking good, except for these two, because they're not perfectly aligned. Which there's actually techniques for making stuff perfectly aligned on a diagonal. I'll go over in my snaps video when I make that. But for now, I don't really care. So anyway, it's just kind of about knowing how to push and pull stuff without breaking it. So for example here, I want to, let's say I want to move this edge back, and you're asking yourself, well, how do you do it without breaking it? Well, there's two ways to do it. One is Subobject Pivot, and the other one is edge constraints. So I can just make a quick and dirty edge constraint pull. I think my hotkeys aren't working, so I apologize for yeah, they're just being a little weird. And then so I'll use snaps to come and meet this edge again. So I make them planar. And so let's say I want to break it up just a little bit more. Start adding some bevels. Whatever. Let's fix that end gone so it doesn't shade bad. Now, to me, this is kind of like, you can call this mid-poly modeling. You can call it low-poly modeling. I don't really care. For me, this kind of stuff is how I usually block out stuff for Sub-D, is I try and keep stuff low, and I try and I just try and keep it low and unsubdivided like this so I can work with it. I always use my smoothing groups, and I have them hotkeyed actually to kind of preview how things will shade. And so you can see that they're going to shade well. And so I just kind of break stuff up like that, because I know at the end of the day I'm going to want this to have a Sub-D edge. Like all of these will be Sub-D. But yeah, once you have stuff planar, doing this in Sub-D is super easy. Like there's nothing really challenging, because you don't have to fight anything except for edge flow and terminating edges. Like it's very simple. So anyway, this is just a random shape that I made. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, hopefully it kind of illustrates a little bit some of the points I made in the video, and you just try to focus on keeping stuff like this, not non-planar. And then you know, the last thing I just want to repeat is it's not the end of the world if things aren't planar. I'm not saying that this is 100% rule. I'm saying though that if something needs to be flat and you need to cut details in it, you need to seriously look at how you're going to do it. You can obviously cut details into non-planar objects, but you're going to be limited by your topology. You're going to be limited by the complexity of the object, the amount of geo on your unsubdivided mesh, all of that stuff. So again, non-planar isn't the end of the world. You know, you can do all sorts of amazing stuff in non-planar. You know, like just know though when you want to use it and when you don't. like, is this a bad model? Is this going to shade well? Actually, yeah, this will shade just fine, even though it's not planar. But the problem is, or what would make this bad, is let's say I want to start cutting in details, like I've said before. So now, if I'm like, okay, well, let's just cut in a little box detail here. Well, that's not going to go so well. You add an edge loop, that's not going to go well. And then you want to add, let's say you wanted the edges to be hard. It's over. It's not going to look good. You're going to get this pinching. It's not going to look good. So, could I do this? Yes, if I had more edges, more segments, etc. Or I just plan when and where to put my details. So, anyway, the point of the video is try and avoid non-planars on flat surfaces. Know that if you put details into non-planars, you're going to have pinching and shading errors. And yeah, that's about it. And, you know, hopefully people find this helpful. I'll have a link to like my Instagram, my ArtStation, and my Gumroad. And then, yeah, so if you guys want to ask me any questions about anything, or you just want to see what I'm doing for whatever reason, feel free. So, anyways, I'm planning to make more of these videos. I just wanted to make quick tip videos to kind of help people out with things that I feel like would help people. I don't really know. But anyway, yeah. I will see you guys next time.